And while I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself, I am just excited to be here. I just watched the film for the second time and feel like I need to watch it the third time as well. But I'm Gwen Whiting, and I am with Everyday Democracy. I'm the Director of Training and Leadership Development. And I'm just excited, first of all, to meet the filmmaker and the producers of this great film. As an African-American female, a homeowner, growing up poor, a lot of the things I could just relate to. And so I just am excited for the opportunity to facilitate this conversation. I know we're going to be together until 8 o'clock, and we're going to hear from the folks who made this film happen. And then we're going to give you as the audience a chance to ask questions. And so you'll put your questions in the chat, and we want to thank Naisha and Alina for managing that. And I do want to recognize Martha Mccoy, who's our executive director at Everyday Democracy. So yay, Martha. Okay. So we're going to start off by, we have on the screen, and if we're not going to go through major bios, we'll put the links in the chat if you want to know more. But we're going to start with Kafi Dixon, because ladies first is how I roll. So Kafi is one of the producers of this film. And then James, please correct me if I don't pronounce Rudenbeck. Is that correct?
Yep.
All right. So James Rutenbeck, who was the filmmaker and is the filmmaker, and he's with us. Carl is not with us this evening, but we do want to recognize his role in this too, as well as the other players. And it's not even a player because this was real. And so thank you all for being here, and thank all of the audience for joining us this evening. So I would like to start off, and again, just to remind you, if you have questions, we're going to give you a chance to ask questions, put them in the chat, and it is being monitored, okay? So I want to start off with a question that came to mind as I was watching this evening, and James or Kafi, either one of you can jump in, but I'd like to hear from both of you. In terms of rolling out this film, I'd like to know what the outcomes that you were looking for as you rolled out this film, and what success that you're having in terms of the outcomes that you set, as well as the aha moments that came about in terms of recognizing structural racism and where it came into play. I do want to say that Everyday Democracy, if you have looked at our information, we're an organization that work with communities around the country. And even I've actually taken it outside of the country in some of the work that I've done, where we believe that the only way to have a democracy is that everybody has an opportunity to participate in a community. And so we bring those resources and tools to the community. We help to coach and mentor folks to give them the capacity to work in our communities, to be the change leaders in our communities, and to create that change as a collective community. And so we use the process of dialogue. And so we want to talk about that as well. But having that background, anxious to know what your outcomes were in terms of rolling out this film. How's it going for you? And then what are those aha moments that came about in terms of how structural racism sort of reared its head in the film? So who would like to start?
Kafi, do you want to start?
I feel like I've been gardening so much. I think the sun has baked my brain, and we haven't done a few panels in a while. So, and jumping into this, and I feel like when I'm out, that I'm probably a victim of my own success or the success of the project, because when I am out in that space that was created for women, everything does just disappear, right? And I was making notes to make sure I answered all of the questions. So sorry that went into the chat box. The how's it going? You know, one of the things that I tried to encourage people to think about, and when you're not from Boston, right? Um, it sometimes can be hard to understand Boston. And I think there is a lot of there's not enough thought into understanding not just the history of New England, but the history of Boston and the challenges that it has faced in its own growth and development historically, the challenges it faces in race and class. So to try to explain to people, I lived in Hartford for a while, and I remember um, when I first moved to Hartford, and I'm sorry, don't mean to trigger this because I dispelled this myth. I remember being in the North End and hanging out with some new friends that were neighbors, and they were like, you know, that's West Hartford. If your car is not registered and stuff, you got to be careful when you go over that bridge because the police might run your plates, right? The police might run your plates. And they made an assumption because of the disconnect with that community that it was a difficult community to be a part of. And I remember in my immaturity at the time saying, well, if that's at least you know where the people are that you perceive don't like Black people, because in Boston we don't know anymore, so they could be your neighbors. And that in understanding how we integrate with other communities, we have yet here in Boston and enforced integration, had the conversation around what that looks like and how to be nonviolent in those spaces. So what are the understanding of structural racism came to me in this work. Immediately when I relocated back to Boston, the town I was born in, from Connecticut, I became aware of what structural racism was and the ease of living in Hartford and in community and walking my children to school and having access to certain things that were difficult here in a heavily resourced city. I realized that the lack of resources in a heavily resourced city to specific communities was racism within itself. That gentrification and who gets amenities within communities was a racism within itself. And I'm not talking about a Whole Foods from a C-town or a Bravo Plaza, but I'm talking about fresh food from a lack of fresh food. So and understanding, and the structural racism became clearly apparent in talking about that on the North End in Hartford. I was able to have a produce stand on the corner of in front of Golden Crust. There were Black women who had hair salons, you know, there were Black homeowners and who rented to POC tenants. That there were things that were going on in that city with its lack of resources, that in a heavily resourced city, we're not just missing, but we're blatantly denied. And in trying to figure out why, what was that denial and what was behind it, and that ominous feeling that you get that something makes you different. I was luckily taken in by some thoughtful people at Tufts University, Dr. Fernando Ona, to be specific, a tenured professor of public health, who explained to me what structural racism was, what social determinants of health were, who questioned me and interrogated me about what the Commonwealth of Massachusetts meant for Black women and men, and who encouraged me to work with James, right? Um, to have that unspoken conversation of the granular experiences of women like me on the ground in a city that just seemed to forget about us, right? Um, as far as a quick how's it going and outcome, I'm sure we'll get into that deeply in this conversation as well. But after 4 years of pushing the city for this project, we were finally able, during COVID of all times, while the city was shut down, to get all of our beds into the ground. And I want to back up really quickly before I transition this over to James. Because one of the things that's important to understand about this documentary, as people question, because I understood there would be, in some screenings in our earlier iterations of the documentary, I knew there were some privileged people who were like, well, maybe she didn't know how, she wasn't a farmer. She didn't know anything about agriculture. Why should the city give her land? You know, there was, of
Mhm.
course, this pushback on me as a person to justify whiteness's denial of a simple request around basic human needs. So I sometimes I often forget, but to remind us in this space, I am a trained and certified USDA farmer and grower. And in Hartford, Hartford was kind enough to allow me to put up farmers markets and produce stores without even blinking an eye and asking any questions about zoning, right? And so, and I've had businesses. I had a furniture store in the North End, on the Bloomfield border, Good Night's Mattress Shop, which was in itself a social entrepreneurship, as I was selling mattresses to women who couldn't afford mattresses and who were being swept up in 51A neglect reports for not having furniture for their children to sleep on once the social worker showed up. So, you know, and coming back to Boston, I was like, this is nothing for me. I've done this in Hartford, right?
Mhm.
Easy. And it was not. It was not. So, and I remember, coming to the end of this, I remember trying to encourage the people as they wanted to celebrate urban farming and celebrate resilient communities. I remember almost being like prophetic and talking about like, well, if you understand that there's a problem with the food system and that it's not sustainable to get our food from California, and that working class people who don't have food stamps might be even more food insecure than people who do, then why is there a pushback for an urban farm? And why is there a pushback for, you know, around this conversation that you guys have picked up around food with dignity and equity? And I said, you know, so if you're talking about resilient cities and flooding and, you know, the Eastern Seaboard electrical grid going offline, then, and you want to integrate Black and Brown people into the food system, why am I sitting here with two other women begging for something? So it was only until the COVID came that we just went out there and built 42 raised beds, 8 by 4 feet by 8 feet, some 4 feet by 12 feet, and we're able to grow well over 600 pounds of produce and able to serve the community quietly, serve independent living facilities for seniors quietly, and finally able to do the work that we were asking to be able to do for our community.
Thank you. I thank you so much for doing the comparison between your experience in Hartford, specifically in Connecticut, and in Boston. Because as we were preparing for this, my question was, what would a reckoning in Hartford look like, in Connecticut look like? So thanks for doing that comparison and starting that conversation, which we'll come back to.
Yeah.
But I do want to give James a chance to reflect on the questions too. So James.
Sure, yeah. I just want to thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Everyday Democracy, for having us. We've been really looking forward to this conversation. I'll just pick up on what Kafi said about, you know, people questioning what she was doing. And this idea of the aha moment for me. I mean, I think there were like more than a few aha moments during this 5-year journey with Kafi and with Carl. I think what happened, you know, one of the things for me was looking at Kafi and these other women who were trying to do something that I don't think anyone would argue was, I think anyone from any political perspective would say was a good thing. Like people, you know, women from a neighborhood who were trying to grow food and be entrepreneurial about it and distribute it and claim the land that is next to them. And yet it, you know, I saw over like 2 or 3 years how the city was like resisting it. And that, you know, despite Kafi's efforts or emails, meetings with the city, there was just like nothing happening. And they were asking her for, you know, they were just making all these demands over the years and asking for more from her and from the other women. And at first I thought, well, maybe, you know, this is the process, this is how it should work. They need to like go through the proper procedures. But the problem was, and what I realized over time was there was no transparent procedure to do that. And Kafi never really, and that's the one thing Kafi was always looking for, was transparency from the city, more than, I think, more than anything else. And so that, you know, other women in the future would know how this could work, and it could become something other women do more easily. And you know, I say in the film that like, I came to see this for what it was, something really dark. And, you know, I felt like the city was blocking what they were trying to do, what Kafi and the other women were trying to do. And that was a big aha moment for me. And then there were other moments when we went to, Kafi invited me to go to housing court with her. And I saw, you know, dozens of families who were facing eviction, who were in this chaotic space, with most of them without legal support, who were having to try to hold on to the little bit of security they had in terms of housing in a city that was just like not offering much of anything in terms of alternatives, in terms of affordable housing. And then there was the time that we went to the housing agency when they had been threatening to take away Kafi's Section 8 certificate for months. It had been going on for months. Kafi had done everything they asked, and they were resisting. And then when I showed up, it was all like resolved. Like the problem ended as soon as I was there. And, you know, it was these things that like sort of pulled me from being what I started out being, was sort of wanting to be a moral witness or an observer, sort of into the fray with Kafi in a way. And realizing that I had a part in this too, you know, and that, you know, some people say, well, this is a really incendiary film. And, you know, all that we did was tell the stories of two people who, of limited means, who lived in the city, people of color. We were just telling their story, like, and that somehow, because of like the reality of life in Boston for people of color, became incendiary, which in some ways still surprises me. And I think that, I don't want to speak for Kafi, but I think both of us sort of feel like we became like social justice warriors, like despite ourselves, like we were sort of like pulled into it, maybe against our will a little bit. Like I didn't necessarily start out wanting to do that, but that's how it turned out in the end. And in terms of what we really want for this film is to be seen and to have conversations like this. And we have this engagement campaign. Margaret told me that we've had so far scheduled, we've had like 30 different national organizations around the country who have participated, who have been involved in Q&As with us. Mm-hmm. Like probably around 3,000 people have seen the film in this way. And we feel like, you know, we're making some headway, or at least it feels like that to us, you know, in terms of racial progress. So yeah, that's.
Hopefully we're making headway.
We hope so. Yeah, I guess you never know, right?
Well, thank you both for that. And I see that there's some questions, but I think because of the numbers that we have, actually people could ask their questions. Just unmute themselves and ask the question. I know that a question came from Martha to the two of you. And Naisha, can you help me out in terms of managing that? Let's see.
Sure. And yeah, Martha, I see you unmuted. And by all means, please.
Thanks. Thanks. You know, I just, again, just powerful experience to knowing that it was going on for such a long time too. That was something that I kept, there was a sense of just trying this and trying that. So I guess my question is, in this, moment we're in the country, do either one of you have like a sense of, do you have a sense of where a breakthrough might happen that could lead to some kind of shift in this web of deeply embedded structural racism? I mean, in Boston, but also in our country, if you want to go that big, but just from everything you've been thinking about, just would love to hear your reflections on that.
I'm going to close my window, although I love my neighbors. They're enjoying themselves in their yard as they should. The thing that makes this conversation so amazing, and I keep threatening my children with that I'm returning to Hartford. And I screenshot it that it was only an hour and 20 minutes from Hartford to I think Brattleboro, Vermont. I was like, we can do this. I'm talking to my friends. But I've essentially given up on Boston. And I've given up on Boston because, again, being victims of our own success. There's so much money involved in it at this point in development that one have to understand that. The second thing we'd have to understand is that the plans for Boston, zoning doesn't happen overnight, right? And this does have to do with the structural racism, because the structural racism and marginalizations of these communities go back to redlining, right? It goes back to a community feeling, the community that was in Roxbury feeling that their property values were going down because Black and brown people were moving into their neighborhoods, the next doors. We were a victim of that. We also have to understand here in Massachusetts that we were one of the last towns in the state recently, in the beginning of 2000, was finally got rid of its sundown laws, right? The embeddedness of racism in these communities. We also have to understand here in this city, and then I'll think out with the organization, back to the zoning. So these zoning plans have been in place since the 50s and 60s. The decisions around empty lots, and I think what always really messes people up in conversations with me is that still in their own bigotry, they underestimate. They hear that I don't have a high school education. They hear that I went to a college class because of feeling a lack of confidence about not having a high school education. And then they underestimate the work I've done to talk about liberation of communities. So they don't know that I've sat with scholars talking about how did we get here in order to figure out a way, how do we get out? So when they want to come up against me about, empty lots, and I have to get back to them about, it's not empty lots, it's land use policies that have been in place for the 60s that wanted to deny Black and brown communities as a backlash to redlining, denied them access to have yards in their houses and to keep those lots in the city cachet for the city's later use, right? Not the community's later use, but the city's later use. And that's why there were so many empty lots, that after redlining and houses were burned down and the Black and brown people were like, well, I'm going to clean this lot. Can I turn it into a driveway? The city made a policy according to a dissertation and a research that one of our interns did for us, made a policy that they'd rather deny the Black and brown communities access to those lots than give it to them for them to have more equity in the community. The last thing I was saying about zoning, so these plans have been in place. They're already 5, 10, 15 years out with how development will look in this city. And whether you got, one of the things is for every different audience, I have a different perspective. And for this perspective in Hartford, one of the things that I asked people who are coming from other communities to better understand the documentary is to better understand that Boston's intention is to push its Black and brown community out of the city into Rhode Island, Connecticut, Western Mass, Pittsfield. Those are the zoning meetings. Those are the meetings that are happening right now about transportation in New England, that are happening in Boston, where the people, the Black and brown people who can't afford to stay in the city with their Section 8s are better in other places. And they started doing this almost maybe about 15 years ago. They started giving these mobile Section 8 certificates and encouraging people to move to other cities and states. That's how integrated this system is. So do I think that all of a sudden now, because we've identified structural racism, that the city's going to go, whoa, 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 we're being violent? You know, we are being bigoted. We are a tool of racism? No. But what I do say is to other communities who want to understand how this happens in Boston, to be aware that this could very much happen in Hartford. And that, you know, on those mornings when I'm going through Keeney Park, hanging out with my friends, you know, sitting there listening to music, those women, I talk about that Keeney Park is a commons. As they put up the barriers that you couldn't go through the park, and then said it was because someone sold drugs to the governor or was trying to sell drugs to the governor. But I say to them, I'll sit there with my hand rolled cigarette, you know, and my coffee with my feet up on the dashboard, listening to music. And with these women and men, I'll say, but you know, this is a commons. And ask them to think about what a commons is. And I'll talk in our language, like, sis, you know, this is the fucking commons. You ain't supposed to be putting this shit up right here. I'm being real with you because that's the language they understand, right? What do you mean that's a commons, Coffee? This is a public park and you're supposed to be able to go into those areas and use the park, because that's what Frederick Olmsted Law built this park for and designed Keeney Park for, along with Central Park, along with Boston Commons, right? Because there's no cricket in there anymore, right? So the thing about understanding Hartford, the beauty of Hartford, is that you guys are ahead of the curve. And there's an innate sense of community, even though it's still segregated. And that's not a totally bad thing. But there is a sense of community in that city that can speak to the violence that's being experienced in Connecticut right now. And but you would have to now think about, how do you make sure that you're not being a tool of structural racism, of liberal white heroicism? How are you providing those communities with the resources to create their own resiliency, right? As you have a stadium, as you have common food kitchens, as we're having more conversations about what food sovereignty looks like, as we're having more conversations about how do we decrease violence, how do we do community economic development. So, you know, that's the structural racism in Boston is not going to go away. They can't even admit that there is structural racism in the city. They don't talk about the history of racism. But the thing that makes all of the surrounding cities in New England amazing, fertile spaces is that you guys can definitely get ahead of those conversations. And not even in New England, in small towns across the country. And before we jump off this line, if you want to ask me how we do that, I will give you my perspective, because I don't believe it's solely mine, on how we pull these communities up and give them dignity, decrease violence, and restabilize them.
Thank you, Kafi, and thank you for being real in terms of sharing your experience. And I do want to pause. I know we said we'd end this at 8, and if some of you have to jump off, we understand, but can you give us at least another 15 minutes to ask a few more questions while we have James and Kafi with us? So we'd like to carry it on till 8:15, okay? James, did you want to respond as well? Thank you, Kafi. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just say, I mean, I do think that, you know, having sort of learned more about the history of Boston and looking at the Charles Stewart case and looking at busing in 1974, that, you know, one thing I thought a lot about while I was editing the film was this idea that, you know, there's never been any kind of like truth, justice, or reconciliation around busing or around Charles Stewart or any of these things that you know, that were you know, these really traumatic historical incidents that have scarred our city, you know, and I do feel pretty strongly like until we address it in that way and like face it and try to reconcile it, I don't see how, you know, we can move forward in terms of like racial and social justice. Like, I think that's a big piece of it, and we are trying very hard to. There are efforts now to have truth and justice reconciliation initiative in Boston, and we're trying to be a part of that. And so that would be a start, I would think. I mean, I totally understand what Kafi's saying, and it makes sense to me what she's saying, that it seems extraordinarily difficult, but I think that, you know, we just have to try to make a start at least. We have this like amnesia about these things that happened here. And, you know, when I was in the Clement classroom, there were students there who had been bused as children to South Boston and Charlestown, and they're still feeling the pain from that experience. And so those neighborhoods have been gentrified. They're very different places now, but, you know, those scars are still there.
Gwen, there's a question in the chat from Jenny. Jenny, you are welcome to ask your question if you'd like. I also don't mind sharing as well. But Jenny wanted to hear some ideas from Kafi around building resilience that you had shared.
Yeah. The reason that I talk about Hartford so intimately is because Connecticut, it's a very amazing state. And I say this because the access between urban areas and green space, you know, we take for granted how you can be in the North End and then drive straight up Bluefield and be in tobacco country, right? We take for granted driving by Trinity College and the amount of trees, even with the dilapidated housing, right? We take for granted maybe, you know, Keeney Park and so much green space that's in that state. In the autonomy by hook or crook, I'm not sure how some of those communities have had autonomy to design in a cultural way that sustains them, that, you know, it seems that they're okay with. The one thing that Hartford, Connecticut's missing, in most small towns, if you look into them, are missing, is education. And education is a lack of education is a precursor to many types of violence. And I see so many women when this work that we did, it wasn't just in Boston. I mean, James gave me a heck of a lot of his airline points to fly back and forth to DC, to sit with the USDA, to sit with the Department of Education, you know, to participate in, to sit on community boards, to go talk to landowners and farmers, and everywhere from Petal, Mississippi to Atlanta, Georgia, to small business owners, right? To talk about what resilience looked like for them. So, and to bring that back to our community. So the only thing that's, well, what I see is the priority in Hartford is the education of that community to be able to withstand the type of development, exclusionary development that's happened in Boston. And that's one of the things that I see mostly when I'm not saying what programs are going. This is not an indictment on what works or programs are already there. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm saying when I sit with those women and I use that language, right? That vernacular, right? That common language between us that makes them realize that I am you, sis. I know you, right? Regardless of what work I do. The only thing that's missing behind the faces of those brown women and my Puerto Rican and my Latinx women there is that they don't have education for whatever reason. There's a deficit in academic education and also an education about how they see themselves, and especially with the reason that there's so much violence in Hartford is how they see their children. They're missing the dream of what they can be, and by default missing the dream of what their children can be. And I think if that's something that could be, that if you could grasp on that with that community, that it could change the trajectory of so many small communities around the country, because you can also look at where there was a denial of education and how that's contributed to the social ills that have been victims of death, like George Floyd and so many other people. I would challenge somebody to do a little bit of research on that, the denial of education and increased violence in smaller communities.
Thank you for that. One of the things I noticed in the film, there was a meeting that you were in, and there were all of the white people sitting on one side of the table, Black folks were sitting on the other, and you all got up from the table at the end of the meeting and feeling like, not a whole lot was accomplished. And one of the things that we do is to bring people together to talk about, remove those barriers, and really give people an opportunity to sit and talk about an issue in a constructive way, with the idea that there will be some collective action that will come out of it. Do you see windows of opportunity that this could actually happen as you go on your journey for how you're approaching these issues in the community?
One of the things that we're not ready for as a society, and white liberal society, I can understand conservative society. I get it. I can get white conservatism in all of its moments, right? But I think the biggest problem, and for our brothers and sisters out there are many jokes and skits that are done by Black communities about what white liberal heroicism looks like, right? And how problematic it is. The realness of having these conversations, and we've all been there, and we were asked yesterday with American University to talk about why I use the word interrogate so much. And I told them that I was given that word or stole that word from Dr. Professor Ona, because to question ourselves whether we're right or wrong in that moment or in our response is one question. We walk away, we feel better, and we don't think about it again. To interrogate is to constantly question who we are in that moment, what we said, and what our actions were. And if we were accurate in looking at the other person across, if we interrogated ourselves about what they were trying to communicate to us. What happened is that Sheila Dillon is not, she is not the evilest thing in the world. No, she was not interrogating herself about why I, as a middle-class bus driver at the time, and a woman who just wanted to go farm and live my life, would bring two women into that room and say, no, this is not enough, not for me, but for them. So in interrogating ourselves, you need to constantly ask yourself, well, why did I deny that person that promotion or that project or that moment to speak? Or why did I not want to hear them? Why did I react the way I did, right? What were they asking me for? Could I have not given it to them? And that's the interrogation part of it. And there people, because I am a Black woman and because I have no university behind me, and hopefully everyday democracy will take me up and shake me off and make me something more in this space. unfortunately, a lot of people in Boston would sooner just replicate this work and act like they never saw the documentary. They will replicate, and they will, white liberals will, throw flowers at their feet. Oh my God, I can't believe you came up with this project of a cooperative urban farm for Black women. You are so smart, right? Because it's easier that is easier than to understand why communities of color are asking for their own autonomy. It's easier than to just do investment or funding into a project led and run by Black and brown women and say, just give us a report and go about your way. We don't need to sit in here and micromanage or practice a form of supremacy that within itself is violent. So in answering that question, I think that we need to constantly interrogate ourselves on how we are creating space, how are we or are we not being inclusionary, and question what we perceive as the goodness of our being, and if it's truly good for all, right? And those are the first steps.
Thank you. And one of my favorite words is amen on that, Kafi.
Yeah.
Thank you. Before we close out, James, I want to give you an opportunity to say some final words.
Okay, I guess I would just sort of pick up on what Kafi was saying a little bit from my perspective, because people ask me, what could we do as white people and what can we contribute? And Kafi really helped me think about this in a way, because it's not an easy thing at all to think about, because we're talking about like overwhelming, long-standing structures that are just really difficult to think about as an individual. But this idea of self-interrogation and like always sort of keeping yourself in check in a way, and thinking about the life that you live, where you live, the school, maybe if you teach at a school or go to a church or whatever institutions you're involved with, like thinking about what their place is in this system, and what could you do within your own sphere to try to like chip away a little bit at white supremacy, or contribute in some small way to changing the world that you're already embedded in. It's the most hopeful thing that I've heard and can think about. And I've tried, since meeting Kafi and spending time with Carl and Kafi and Fernando, it's something I'm trying to practice in my own life.
I wanted to add this in because this is something that's very specific to culturally to Black and brown women, again, holding in space our Latinx sisters out there. And I know what makes this conversation challenging sometimes is that I can understand how there's a challenge to whiteness, right? And that there may be guilt, shame, or regret, right? For what the ills of the past or the potential, beliefs of the future. I don't have a problem with whiteness, right? I don't have a problem with people of other races and cultures of European descent. There is still Black people who are white facing and Latinx people who are white facing and uphold white supremacy. What I say is that we have to really think about if we're being inclusionary in talking about the humanity of people and their well-being, right? And hypothesizing about how we make this a better world, how we speak towards violence. Are we putting the power in the hands of the people who most need those tools to fight back? And that's not something that makes me anti-white. It makes me pro-POC, right? And an advocate for a world in which we all feel safer, more acknowledged and held, in community. Our words feel held. So I know there will be people that will come along in Connecticut who will have that same fire at some point, and it's not to be afraid of them, the Black and brown sisters who are asking for more, and men and women. It's to either interrogate our own complacency, and if we are complacent, pass the baton over to someone else, or give that power to that person who is activated in that moment, and allow them to design, right? Allow them to heal their community and to really be resilient, which is what we all seek in the end.
I want to thank you, Kafi, and thank you, James, for, first of all, putting this film together. And we're about bring the opportunity to bring people together to have a discussion, have a dialogue. But as someone put in the chat, this was not a discussion this evening, this was a master class. And from this master class, we're hoping that we can create some small group conversations to continue what you all have triggered for us. And also want to know, when is the next film coming out and what's it going to be about? But in the meantime, we will continue. I'm glad that we recorded this so that we can look back at it. But I do want to thank you all, and really cannot say enough about how much I have gotten out of this. And I see people nodding their heads to say the same thing. And just continue the good work. Naisha, did you want to?
I just wanted to call attention to the survey link that is in the chat, and we do welcome your thoughts and feedback. And just to add on to what Gwen said, in that survey, we are asking if individuals would like to join us for other discussions. And I do have to just say one plug, like Kafi, yes, to your earlier statement about like, if everyday democracy will take you on. I'm speaking out of turn, possibly. My boss is in the room, but I'm just saying.
Like, no, I do. I speak. It's not just about Hartford. It's that Hartford has something that I feel is unrealized. And I feel that Hartford, that Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, can show Massachusetts something. And it's not me hating Massachusetts or Boston. It's saying that somewhere you went wrong, right? But there's still an opportunity for other places and people and organizations to go right, to do the right thing. So hopefully your bosses won't wince too much. I come bring in really good coffee. I'm hoping that somewhere in the
Boss is really happy. The boss is really happy. Coffee, I was already on it.
And yeah, and I would love to, we'd love to be able to show some of these organizations here in Boston, like, this is how you do community development. When you see women walking home with, recycled bags from Bravo Plaza, and they're full of fresh vegetables, and you see neighbors helping neighbors. We may be too far gone for that, but in Connecticut and a lot of smaller towns across this country, we're not.
Yes.
Hey, thank you so much. And let's give our panelists a hand. We so appreciate
Thank you so much. Fantastic
yes.
program.
Thank you. This was
Thank
fabulous. So
Absolutely.
much.
Thank you.
They want to recognize Kafi. You all even drew out our board members. We got a number of board members watching too. So.
Yeah, you'll see me up there. If you guys don't take me on, you'll definitely see me when they open that park back up and there's cricket games again. You will see me there.
Tell us when.
Drinking
Tell
the
us when to be
homemade
there.
juice with my feet up on the dashboard on my pickup truck, hanging out with my friends with my little New Balance on. Or you're gonna see me gardening.
Can't wait. Can't
You guys
wait.
got a lot of lots up there. So yeah, I look forward to it. And thank you for allowing us to share our perspective. And thank you for the work that Everyday Democracy is doing. It's organizations like this. I keep saying that there were a lot of organizations who turned down this this documentary. And Margaret's probably like, don't say who they are. But I say that there's a difference between people who are really doing the work and who want to understand the work and people who are being performative. So this is also a nod to, doing the real work. So I thank you, Gwendolyn, and everybody that's on the call, and Nisha as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
James.
you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Blessings. James. Blessings.
We'll see each other. Nisha,
yeah.
we'll see each other too.
Yes, we will.
Bye.
Bye.